In a nearly empty diner just outside Cleveland, the rain tapping on the windows like a quiet warning, she placed the check on the table and stood still. No smile, no sales pitch, just tired eyes behind a coffee-stained apron. Then, with a voice that barely broke the silence, she asked, "Would you consider leaving a $50 tip?" Most people would have laughed or left, but not J.D. Vance. He didn't move, didn't blink, because in that moment, something about her stopped him cold. 3 days later, that same waitress would find her name whispered in places she never imagined, and everything that came next started with 8 words and a man who'd once been forgotten himself. This story is inspired by true emotions, but it is a dramatized, fictional account, crafted to reflect deeper truths about struggle, dignity, and the quiet courage that too often goes unseen. The names, events, and details have been fictionalized for creative storytelling, but what you're about to feel is entirely real. So let me ask you, what does a $50 question reveal when the right person finally listens? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The rain didn't fall in drops. It slashed sideways, carried by a wind that made Cleveland's skyline vanish into gray. Neon signs flickered like tired lungs. Garbage cans rolled along the sidewalk like forgotten promises. Somewhere between the courthouse and the hotel he was supposed to be staying in, J.D. Vance turned right when no one expected him to. No driver, no aide, no coat. Just a man in a soaked navy blazer walking toward a block no senator visits after dark. The bell above the diner door gave a weary jingle, like it had grown tired of being noticed. Inside, the place smelled like burnt espresso and overcooked marinara. Dim lights hummed overhead. Red vinyl booths peeled at the corners. There was a photo on the wall of Frank Sinatra shaking hands with someone no one remembered anymore. J.D. stood there for a moment, not lost but undecided, like a man standing at the edge of something not yet named. He scanned the room, one old man playing solitaire at the counter, a couple arguing in whispers, and her, Emma Grace. She moved like someone who hadn't slept in 3 nights, the kind of tired that settles not in your bones, but in your soul. She wore a burgundy apron that had clearly been washed too many times, tied over a faded t-shirt that once said, "Cleveland State." Her ponytail was loose, her eyes sharper than anyone else's in the room, but dulled at the edges, like they'd once been bright but had seen too much. She placed a glass of water on a table, refilled a ketchup bottle, and scratched at a red welt on her wrist like it was second nature. She didn't look up when J.D. sat down, didn't flinch, didn't ask for his order, just said, "Menu's on the table. Kitchen closes in 40. J.D. didn't respond. He just nodded and studied her, not in judgment, in recognition. There was something about her, a familiarity that nagged at him like a half-forgotten name. Outside, thunder cracked. Inside, time seemed to hesitate. Emma disappeared behind the counter, speaking briefly to the cook in Spanish. Then she picked up a small notepad, walked over, and stood by J.D.'s table. Not writing, not smiling, just waiting. "I'll take whatever's hot," J.D. said finally. "Spaghetti or soup?" "Soup." "You sure?" "Not really." That earned him the faintest twitch of her lip, maybe a smile, maybe just exhaustion shifting. She turned without a word, and that's when he noticed it. A small, worn sketchbook wedged into the back pocket of her jeans. The corner of a drawing peeked out, a pencil outline of a man sitting alone at a table. J.D. blinked. That couldn't be. But before he could look again, she was gone. There was no music playing, only the sound of a broken ceiling fan clicking in uneven rhythm. J.D. pulled out his phone. No signal. A dozen unread texts from the staffers. A draft tweet from 2 hours ago, still unsent. He put it down. For the first time in weeks, he let the silence speak louder than the headlines. And across the diner, Emma sat briefly on a crate behind the counter, pulled off her apron, and checked her phone. One missed call from Mom, hospital. No voicemail, just the silence that hurts more than bad news. She looked toward J.D.'s table, and for a second, just a second, her eyes locked with his. That's when she made her decision. That's when she stood up, straightened her apron, walked over, and asked him a question that no one ever expected. The soup came in a chipped white bowl, steaming faintly beneath the glow of a flickering bulb overhead. JD stirred it slowly, not out of hunger, but habit, like someone trying to delay what couldn't be delayed. Across the room, Emma leaned on the counter, wiping down menus with a rag that had given up long ago. It was a strange silence that hung between them. Not awkward, not cold. Just fragile. Like both of them knew something deeper had already begun to stir the moment their eyes met. She walked over with his water refill, set it down, then paused and just long enough for him to speak. "You from around here?" JD asked, voice casual but low. Emma shrugged. "Used to be. Looks like a long shift." "That obvious?" she said, with the faintest huff of air that might have been a laugh. He nodded, let the moment breathe, then said quietly, "Everything all right?" She hesitated, the first real pause since he'd arrived. Not long, just enough to decide between the polite lie and the raw truth. She chose the second. Her voice didn't crack. It didn't lower to a whisper. It came out soft but level. The kind of voice you use when you've run out of layers to hide behind. "Would you consider tipping me $50? The air changed, not just between them, in the room. Even the humming of the fridge seemed to still for a second. JD blinked, spoon still midair, frozen in place. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Her posture didn't shift like she was ashamed or desperate. It was the posture of someone too tired to beg, too proud to explain, and too smart to expect anything from anyone anymore. JD set the spoon down. "Why 50? He asked. Emma gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, not amused but honest. "Because that's what the electric bill costs if I want the heat back on. Because my mom's chemo got delayed again. And because pretending I'm okay for another week costs at least that much." Her voice had no anger in it, just math. Just math and miles. JD said nothing, not out of judgment, but because he hadn't heard a sentence that honest in months. Emma didn't move. "You don't have to," she added. "I just figured you look like someone who might see it." JD studied her. Really studied her. The tired eyes, the steady voice, the sketchbook still half tucked in her pocket like a forgotten scream. He wanted to say something clever, something reassuring, but every word felt too small, so instead he nodded. Once, slowly. Emma turned to walk away. No triumph in her step, no shame either. Just a kind of dignity that felt heavier than any campaign speech he'd ever given. She didn't look back. But before disappearing behind the kitchen door, she paused and said, without turning around, "Thanks for not laughing." JD sat in silence, staring at his untouched soup. For a man known for speeches, he had never felt words shrink like this. And deep inside, without quite knowing why, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his wallet, and set it gently on the table. JD sat still, the air around him dense and unsettled. He wasn't a stranger to awkward conversations. He'd debated on Senate floors, walked into town halls full of rage. But this was different. He looked down at his wallet resting on the table like a challenge. Then his eyes drifted back toward the counter, where Emma stood scribbling something in her pad with quick, practiced movements. The kind that come not from ease, but from necessity. She didn't glance his way again. He picked up the spoon, stirred the soup once more, then set it down again. Appetite had vanished. What remained was curiosity. Not the political kind, not the tactical kind, the human kind. The kind that keeps you awake at 2 a.m., wondering how much someone can carry before they break. He folded the wallet open, fingers brushing past credit cards and crisp cash, then paused. Slowly, calmly, JD rose from the booth and walked to the counter. Emma didn't look up. She slid a small check in his direction, then turned to reach for a pitcher of sweet tea. He didn't touch the check. Instead, he said, not confrontationally, but with a softness that surprised even himself, "Why 50? Emma froze mid-reach. For a moment, JD wasn't sure if she'd answer. Then she turned slightly, not meeting his gaze, and said simply, "Because I've already pawned my laptop. Because the clinic said we need another week of heat for recovery. Because sometimes when I sleep, I wake up cold and wonder if it's the weather or just life catching up to me. She didn't say it like she was asking for sympathy. She said it like she was reciting a grocery list she'd memorized too well. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, and because nobody tips 50 unless they're trying to say something without using words. Emma didn't wait for his response. She slid the pitcher back into place, walked into the back kitchen, and let the door swing shut behind her. JD stood there a moment longer, then returned to his booth, picked up the check, and placed a single crisp $100 bill beneath it. No note, no message. He just sat quietly, fingers tracing the rim of the empty soup bowl. The storm outside had calmed to a steady drizzle, the thunder rolling farther away like a memory. And still, something lingered, something unshaken. His eyes drifted to the sketchbook that had peeked from her pocket earlier. A single image flashed in his mind, a man at a table, alone, drawn in quick strokes, caught mid-thought. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "I've seen that look before." It wasn't the look of someone broken. It was the look of someone almost broken, but still standing. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. He left the bill, pushed the door open, and stepped into the Cleveland night, not knowing that this moment, quiet, fleeting, unfinished, had just started something neither of them would forget. The rain hadn't stopped. It only softened, as if the sky itself was now hesitating. JD sat by the living room window, elbows resting on the arms of a leather chair, too old to be elegant, but too familiar to replace. The untouched bourbon in his glass had long gone warm. He hadn't taken a sip. His eyes were locked on the glow of his laptop screen, bouncing soft light against his tired face. He'd tried to forget, told himself it was just another encounter. One of many he'd had across the country. But something about her voice, the way she stood so still after asking for $50, like it was the most ordinary question in the world, it kept playing in his mind like a stubborn song. He typed slowly, "Emma Grace, Cleveland. Art hit enter. Dozens of results loaded. A few irrelevant hits. Then one, an archived piece from a regional arts journal dated 7 years ago." JD clicked. The headline read, "Emma Grace, a new voice in postmodern emotion." Below it was a photo, not the tired woman from the diner, but a girl, radiant, wide-eyed, unmistakably her, standing beside a massive canvas filled with crimson spirals and moody shadow work. She wore a simple black dress, hair tucked in a loose braid, and her smile, it was electric. Paris, the caption said, 17 years old, a finalist at the Genevois exhibition, one of the youngest Americans ever invited. JD leaned in. He didn't blink. The article described her as hauntingly intuitive, a painter whose work channels quiet grief into color, raw and unsentimental. A critic had compared her to Kata Kulvitz and predicted she'd reshape the American emotional palette within a decade. He scrolled further. Mentions of a scholarship to Rise D, a residency invitation in Florence, then nothing. No follow-up, no graduation profile, no gallery interviews, just silence, like someone had pressed delete on her future. JD sat back. The weight of it landed hard. Not just the story, but the contrast. The girl in the photo and the woman in the diner were the same person, but something had happened in the space between. Something big enough to reroute a storm. He whispered her name again. Emma Grace. It wasn't just curiosity now, it was something else. Guilt, maybe. Recognition. That fragile line between those who rise and those who disappear, and how thin it really was. He opened a new tab, searched hospital registries, looked for her mother's name. He didn't know why. Maybe to send something anonymously. Maybe just to confirm it was all real. But the system kicked him back. Access denied. Patient privacy protected. JD sighed, rubbed his face with both hands, then stared out the window where headlights slid across puddles like fading stars. He muttered under his breath, half to himself, half to the girl in the photograph, "What the hell happened to you?" And somewhere in the distance, between the sound of the rain and the hum of the city, it felt like that question had already started rewriting his night. The rain had thinned into mist by the time JD clicked back into the article. He wasn't done with her story. Not yet. Something in him, a part that had long grown numb in the marble halls of Washington, had been stirred, and now it wouldn't let go. He traced the digital trail the way he used to track legislation, carefully, methodically, chasing one lead until it opened the next. A mention in a Rise Quarterly alumni page, confirming what the earlier article hinted, Emma Grace had accepted a full scholarship to study painting at the prestigious Boston campus. It was all there, her entry profile glowing with promise, an emerging voice redefining postmodern texture and grief, recipient of the Marcus Fellowship in Contemporary Art. He leaned back, nodding slightly. So it wasn't just hype. She had the goods, and the world had noticed. But then the record went cold. No graduation photo, no gallery debuts, no write-ups, no press. Just silence. JD frowned and typed her name into a public artist registry. Nothing. He tried social media, narrowing by city and field. A handful of Emmas, none matched. A painter's directory listed in E. Grace, inactive since 2017. Frustrated, he started scrolling deeper into old art forums. The dusty corners of the internet, where former students still posted sketch critiques or asked about residencies. And then he saw it. Buried under a thread titled, "Re-entry to art school after long break," was a single post from 7 years ago. Username, Grace Returns. Date, October 3rd, 2018. Text, had to drop out sophomore year, family emergency, looking for re-entry programs. Any recommendations for part-time while caregiving? JD's breath caught in his chest. No drama, no plea, just matter-of-fact pain typed into a void. He stared at the words for a long time, reread them, imagined her typing them in the dim corner of some late-night diner, maybe even this one, maybe even while balancing plates in sorrow. He clicked her profile. One post, no replies, no bio. That was it, the last online trace of Emma Grace, the girl once called a revelation in crimson. He closed the tab slowly, fingers hovering above the trackpad like there was more to say, like she might somehow feel him searching for her. But of course she couldn't. All that promise, all that praise, all that talent evaporated into the silence of a family emergency and a closed laptop. And now she was asking for a $50 tip, as if it were both absurd and entirely reasonable. JD stared out the window again. The streets gleamed with wet reflection, like brushstrokes smudged across the city. How many Emmas had he passed by in his career? How many stories had been swallowed in the cracks between press conferences and committee votes? He stood up, the chair legs scraping softly against the hardwood floor. A decision had taken shape inside him, not fully formed, not righteous, just restless. He reached for his coat. There was only one place to go. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of an old clock JD never remembered buying. He sat back down, this time without the laptop. No more searching, just sitting, thinking. His fingers tapped softly against the armrest. A nervous rhythm, not from fear but memory. He hadn't thought about her in a long time. His mother. He could still see the cigarette tremble between her fingers, the way she'd chain laughter to rage like they were cousins. Her hands had once tucked him in. Later they'd pointed at him, accusing, frantic, lost. The nights he'd hidden behind the doorframe, listening for whether she was angry, high, or heartbreakingly silent. And then Mama, the foul-mouthed, shotgun-carrying miracle in house slippers who took him in when the chaos got too loud. She'd saved him, not with warmth, but with a force that didn't allow collapse. "You don't get to disappear," she once barked. "Not while I'm breathing." He used to resent that line. Now he treasured it like scripture. He turned those words over again as he thought of Emma, of the emptiness between her Paris photo and the waitress apron, the eyes that didn't ask for pity, just oxygen. JD stood and paced toward the window again. The street was empty now. The diner's lights had shut off, but in his mind, he was back there, back at table 4. She hadn't begged, hadn't hinted at some tragic sob story. She just looked him in the eye and asked for $50. Not because he was rich, not because she felt entitled, but because sometimes surviving meant doing the unthinkable with quiet dignity. He pressed his palm to the window pane. What if no one had pulled me back? What if Mama had shrugged and said, "That's not my problem"? What if no one had picked up the phone when the system spit him out? JD felt it in his chest. Not pity, not guilt. Recognition. There were too many people like Emma, people who used to shine and then got swallowed. And they didn't all ask for help. Most didn't. They just vanished. But she hadn't. Not fully. She asked, bold, tired, and plain. And that meant something. He walked back to the table, grabbed his coat, and sat for a moment with one hand resting on the back of the chair. No press release, no political calculation, just a simple truth. He wasn't going to walk away. The rain had eased by the time J.D. Vance returned to the little Italian diner on the corner of 5th and Lehman. The windows still wore streaks of drizzle like old scars, and the neon sign out front buzzed low, casting a tired red glow over the wet sidewalk. Inside, the place looked exactly as he remembered. Faint Sinatra in the background, clinking dishes, and that faint, comforting smell of tomato sauce and garlic bread that reminded him of another life. Emma Grace didn't notice him at first. She was in motion, refilling coffee at a booth near the back, balancing plates with practiced grace, her shoulders slightly hunched under the weight of invisible things. But when she turned and saw him, same worn blazer, same steady eyes, she paused for just a beat too long. He gave a small nod, not wanting to startle her or seem too forward. He chose the same booth, table 4, and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Finally, she came over during a lull, wiping her hands on her apron. She didn't speak right away, just raised one eyebrow as if to ask, "Really? You came back?" JD offered a calm smile. "Thought I'd try the lasagna this time. I hear the sauce is good." Emma didn't smile, but something in her eyes softened. "You're not like most of our regulars." "I get that a lot," he said quietly. She nodded, then walked away without another word, but didn't seem annoyed. JD let the silence settle. He didn't want to pry, not yet. A few minutes later, while he sipped his water, he noticed something unusual. In the far corner of the diner, tucked behind a stack of to-go menus, Emma was sitting at a little server station with a napkin in front of her. Not resting, not eating. Drawing. Her movements were fluid, quick, like someone trying to sketch something before the feeling disappeared. Her hair had come loose from its ponytail, strands falling over her cheek, but she didn't notice. Her world for a moment was in pencil. JD watched in quiet fascination. He remembered the photo of her at 17, standing beside a canvas in Paris, beaming like someone who believed tomorrow was guaranteed. He slid out of the booth and approached slowly, keeping his voice low. "May I see?" Emma startled, then instinctively moved her arm to cover the sketch. But something in JD's tone wasn't invasive, it was reverent. She hesitated. Then without a word, she moved her hand aside. It was a half-finished portrait. A woman, older, face lined by time and tenderness, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, as if caught between song and sleep. JD felt his throat tighten. "Your mother?" Emma nodded once. The silence was heavier this time, not uncomfortable, just full. "She was a music teacher," she said softly. "Used to hum when she cooked. I haven't heard that in a long time." JD looked at the drawing again. The lines weren't perfect, but the emotion, it was devastatingly clear. He looked up. "You still have it, you know." Emma shrugged. "It doesn't matter. Talent doesn't pay hospital bills." JD didn't argue. Instead, he just said, "I came back because something about you reminded me of someone I knew. Someone who almost disappeared before she ever had a chance." Emma gave a skeptical smile. "Did she make it?" JD's answer was quiet. "Only because someone fought for her when she didn't think she was worth the fight." They locked eyes for a second longer. Then Emma looked down, her fingers already reaching for the pencil again. JD stayed near the counter long after the lunch rush faded. The diner's chatter dulled into a low murmur, and Emma, without speaking, slid a slim, spiral-bound sketchbook across the table to him. No preamble, no explanation, just trust. or something close enough to it. He hesitated for half a second, then gently opened it. The first page was raw. A woman, emaciated and pale, lay in a hospital bed, her hair thin and scattered across a pillow. The room behind her wasn't detailed, but the oxygen tube, the IV drip, and the haunting stillness in the woman's eyes told enough. It was intimate, too intimate to be fiction. JD turned the page. A waitress, no doubt Emma, was crouched behind a swinging kitchen door, one hand gripping her apron, the other wiping at her face. No words, no background, but the slump of her shoulders and the messy blur of her mascara told a story even louder than any scream. He turned another page. A child, 5, maybe 6, held a toy syringe in one hand, a juice box in the other. But the smile on his face wasn't playful. It was survival masked as innocence. In the corner, someone had scrawled in pencil, "He doesn't know it's real." JD felt his throat tighten again. These weren't just sketches. They were testimonies, visual confessions from someone who hadn't had time, or maybe the luxury, to speak aloud what she'd lived. He kept flipping. There was a picture of a red eviction notice taped to a rusted apartment door. A line of silhouettes, each representing a different Emma, all carrying trays, all slowly fading in form as the line moved forward, until the last one disappeared entirely. And then, unexpectedly, hope. A drawing of 2 hands reaching toward each other, not quite touching. One hand was firm, deliberate. The other tentative and trembling, drawn with lighter strokes as if Emma herself wasn't sure the hand would accept the help. JD stared at that one for a long time. Behind him, a server dropped a glass. It shattered, but he barely flinched. His mind was lost in those pages, wandering through the heavy terrain of someone else's quiet war. Emma returned, wiping her hands. "Too much?" JD looked up slowly. "No, not enough, actually." She laughed once, sharp and bitter. "That's the first time anyone said that." "You ever show these to anyone?" he asked. She shook her head. "They're not finished." "They don't need to be," JD said. "They already say more than most people do with speeches and books and campaigns." Emma leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You know what's funny? When I was 17, people used to tell me I saw the world in color. Now it's all graphite." He didn't respond immediately. Then, maybe, or maybe you just learned to draw the parts most people ignore. The words landed heavier than either of them expected. Emma looked away, blinking like she didn't want to show him whatever flickered in her eyes. JD gently closed the sketchbook and slid it back toward her. "You're still speaking, Emma, whether you mean to or not." She looked at him for a long moment. "What are you doing here?" He didn't dodge the question. "I think," he said slowly, "I came back to remember who I said I'd be. And maybe to make sure someone like you doesn't disappear." The bell above the diner door rang as someone else entered, but neither of them turned to look. For the first time, Emma didn't hide the weariness in her voice. "I'm not sure I believe in rescue stories anymore." JD's reply was simple. "Then don't call it rescue. Call it recognition." He stood up, nodded once, and walked out, leaving behind a silence thick with unfinished sentences. The sky had turned navy outside, with streaks of silver rain clinging to the glass as if the city itself didn't want to be forgotten. Inside the diner, most of the booths were empty. The hum of the dishwasher in the back kitchen pulsed like a tired heartbeat. Emma slid into the booth opposite JD without asking, a chipped mug of black coffee between her palms, steam curling toward her face. JD didn't speak first. He waited. "I used to draw to live," Emma said finally, eyes locked on the table. "Back then, every line, every color, it was how I processed things. Joy, wonder, even pain." Her fingers tapped lightly against the ceramic. "Now I draw so I don't disappear. That's it. Just so I don't vanish completely." Her voice wasn't theatrical. It wasn't performative. It was flat, quiet, like someone reporting a truth she'd said too many times in her head, but never out loud. JD didn't rush to respond. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "That's tragic." He just looked at her, really looked, and listened, as if the silence that followed her words was just as important as the words themselves. Emma exhaled slowly, her shoulders slumping. "Sorry, you didn't come here for that." I didn't come here for anything, JD said, but I think I stayed for that. She let out a sound that was almost a laugh, almost a sigh. Then the moment passed. The diner's manager called from the kitchen for closing prep, and Emma stood reluctantly. Duty calls, she said with a tired smirk. JD nodded but didn't move. She turned to go, paused, then added, thanks for not turning it into a Hallmark moment. I hate those, JD said. They always skip the part where it's hard. Emma half smiled and disappeared into the kitchen. JD sat a while longer, sipping the last of his lukewarm coffee, watching the rain begin again outside. That's when he noticed the sketchbook, still sitting where she'd left it, spine slightly frayed, its weight almost invisible beside the salt shaker and napkin holder. He reached for it slowly, reverently. It didn't feel like stealing. It felt like guardianship. He placed it in his coat carefully, as though it might shatter if handled too abruptly. As he stepped out into the night, the cold Cleveland rain soaked the sidewalk, but he didn't rush. The streetlights flickered above, reflecting off the puddles like memories too stubborn to fade. Inside his pocket, the sketchbook was warm from the diner's air. JD felt it pressing against his side. Not just paper, not just graphite, but something human, something unfinished. In the cab back to his apartment, he didn't open it again. He just sat quietly, the city glowing in blurred halos through the wet window, and thought of a girl who used to paint with color and now fought to stay visible in gray. He whispered under his breath, almost like a prayer to no one. You're not gone, Emma. Not if someone still sees you. And for once, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt shared. The next morning broke with a brittle grayness, the kind that clung to Cleveland like unfinished business. J.D. Vance stood outside the Ohio Art Foundation's glass-paneled headquarters, the sketchbook under his arm, wrapped in a plain folder. He hadn't worn a suit, just a navy blazer and worn boots. It wasn't about polish today. It was about story. Inside, the boardroom felt more like a sterile bank than a place built to support creativity. A long mahogany table stretched the length of the room, polished to perfection but empty of warmth. 3 evaluators sat at the far end, as if conducting an interview from a moral high ground. One of them, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned tightly back, tapped her pen twice before speaking. Mr. Vance, she said, barely looking up, your request didn't come through the traditional proposal process. I'm not here as a senator today, JD replied calmly, sliding the folder onto the table. I'm here on behalf of someone who never asked to be noticed. They exchanged glances, quick, coded ones, but allowed him to continue. He opened the folder and laid out several sketches, spreading them carefully. The room was quiet. There was the image of the mother in bed, hollow-eyed, hair thinning, the waitress behind the kitchen door, clutching her apron, mouth drawn in tight pain, and the child holding the syringe, grinning in defiance, as if mocking the darkness. These weren't made for sale, JD said, his voice low but steady. They weren't made for acclaim. They were made because this girl was drowning, and art was the only thing she could grab onto. The younger evaluator, a man in his 30s with stylish glasses, squinted at the page. What's her name? Emma Grace, JD said. She had a scholarship once, Boston School of the Arts, top of her class. Then her mom got sick. She dropped everything, future, fame, funding, to come home. She works nights in a diner now, doesn't talk about her past, doesn't ask for help. The silver-haired woman arched an eyebrow. And what exactly are you asking us for, Mr. Vance? JD looked straight at her. A second chance, a spotlight, a studio space, a program, a fellowship, anything that says, we still see you. There was a long silence. Then the third evaluator, a quiet man who hadn't spoken until now, reached for one of the sketches. This line work, he murmured, tracing the drawing without touching it. It's not trained. It's lived. JD nodded. Exactly. The woman with silver hair leaned back in her chair. Do you know how many stories like this come through our door, Senator? Yes, JD said, but this one didn't come through your door. It came through mine, and I'm walking it in. Another pause. Longer this time. The younger evaluator looked between his colleagues. We'll need to vet this. Speak to her. Review the originals. JD stood, gathering the sketches carefully. I'm not asking for favors. I'm asking you to remember why this building was built, not to reward perfection, but to rescue brilliance from silence. He turned, folder in hand, and started walking toward the door. Then came a voice, quiet, almost an afterthought. Leave the sketches, the silver-haired woman said. Let us look closer. JD paused, handed the folder over, and with a final glance, he simply said, You won't find her in galleries. You'll find her in grief, and she's still drawing through it. As he exited into the chilled morning light, the air smelled faintly of rain again. He didn't know what the board would decide, but he knew one thing. The story had landed, and this time, someone was finally listening. 3 days passed. JD waited, checking his inbox more than usual. He wasn't sure what he expected. A form letter maybe, or a phone call cushioned in pleasantries. What he didn't expect was the envelope. Thick, cream-colored, embossed with the seal of the Ohio Art Foundation, delivered to his office by courier, not mail. Almost ceremonial. He slid it open with a letter opener, careful not to tear the message. Inside a single sheet, dense, formal, and polished. Dear Senator Vance, it began, after careful deliberation and appreciation for the work presented, the Foundation regrets to inform you that Ms. Emma Grace does not meet the necessary criteria for consideration. JD sat still, rereading each sentence. They hadn't even called her. No interview. No in-person meeting. Just criteria. No professional portfolio submitted within the last 2 years. No documented mentorship or academic reference. No verified exhibition history post-2019. No exception process available. That was their phrasing. Smooth, distant, almost luxurious in its detachment. Rejection, dressed in silk. He picked up the phone. He wasn't angry yet, but his voice was sharp. Connect me to Meredith Walters, he told his assistant, referring to the silver-haired board member. A minute later, her voice came through, cool and composed. Senator Vance, I assume you received our reply? I did, JD said, and I read every word. What I didn't see was a single acknowledgement of the human being behind those sketches. I understand this is personal for you, Meredith said carefully, but we have standards, and they exist to preserve fairness. Talent alone doesn't constitute readiness. She's not asking for a solo show at the Met, JD shot back. She's asking not to be forgotten. Meredith's tone didn't waver. Without documentation of continuity, recent exhibitions, formal mentorship, there's no mechanism to move her forward. JD clenched his jaw. Then what is art for? To celebrate the survivors who make it? Or to lock the door on those who didn't? There was a pause, only seconds, but it felt like an hour. I'm sorry, Meredith said finally, almost softly. The board has voted. The decision is final. Click. JD sat there, phone still in hand, staring out his office window. The city moved beneath him. Cars, rain, noise, all of it oblivious. He imagined Emma's face when he told her, the way she had clutched that sketchbook like it held her breath. The way her hand trembled just slightly when she said, I draw so I don't disappear. They didn't just deny an application, they denied a lifeline. For a moment, JD wanted to throw something. Instead, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out the folder. Her art was still there, unframed, unlabeled, just real. He whispered under his breath, they don't get to be the last word. Because some things aren't supposed to fit into forms. Some stories weren't meant to be tamed by process, and some artists, the ones who paint through hunger, grief, and invisibility, don't need permission. They need one person who refuses to walk away. JD stood up. The rain had started again, tapping against the glass. He didn't know what he would do next, but he knew it would start with showing her that rejection wasn't the end. It was just the next sketch. JD walked out of the Ohio Art Foundation's glass-paneled building with the rejection letter still folded neatly in his coat pocket. The sky above Columbus was iron gray, the air thick with the kind of humidity that made everything feel heavier. Words, steps, thoughts. He didn't speak to the driver, didn't call his staff. He just kept walking until he reached the corner cafe near the roundabout, ordered black coffee he wouldn't drink, and sat in the farthest booth by the window. He stared out at nothing. The words from the board still rang in his ears. No portfolio, no continuity, no mechanism for exception. But rules were only real until someone broke them. JD reached for his phone and scrolled through until he found the contact, Leo Santiago. They hadn't spoken in nearly a year, not since the bill to protect veteran artists had passed. Leo wasn't political, but he was principled. And more importantly, he ran Gallery Iris in Columbus, a small space known for giving unknown names a real stage. JD pressed call. It rang twice. Vance? Leo's voice came through, warm, rough-edged. Either you need a favor or you're about to run for president. Neither, JD replied. I need a wall. There was a beat of silence, then a light laugh. A wall? Just one, JD said. One wall in your gallery. No spotlight, no banners. One wall, 2 weeks. Leo leaned back in his chair on the other side of town. You don't usually call me for art favors. It's not for me, JD said. He paused. It's for a waitress. She used to be a painter. She still is. Life didn't give her a resume, but her work, it's not decoration. It's survival. Leo let that hang. You want me to hang a stranger's sketches in Iris? No names, no credentials? Yes. What if no one comes? Then I'll never ask again. JD could hear him tapping something on the desk. Then a slow exhale. Bring the drawings. JD's shoulders loosened. Seriously? Leo chuckled. We're called Iris for a reason. We're supposed to see. Bring the sketches. Let's build something. JD ended the call and opened the sketchbook again. Emma's lines stared back at him, raw, crooked in places, but beating like a second heart. He thought of the art foundation board, polished and pristine, sipping mineral water as they denied someone's second chance. And then he thought of the gallery, small, cluttered, imperfect, and a single wall waiting in silence. That night he drove back to Cleveland with the sketchbook on the passenger seat, wrapped in brown paper like it held something sacred. As the miles passed, he imagined Emma seeing her work on that wall. No critics, no competition, just space, just breathe. Sometimes if the system says no, you don't argue. You build a door where their wall stands, and you walk someone through it, quietly, fiercely. It was still early, barely 6:30 a.m., when Emma cracked open her apartment door and found the envelope. Plain white, no stamp, no markings, just her name, handwritten in blue ink so careful it almost looked like a whisper. She stood there barefoot on the welcome mat, still in her oversized diner sweatshirt, blinking away sleep as if the message might shift in the morning light. She opened it with cautious fingers. Inside, one line. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., bring the sketchbook. Just be yourself. That was it. No sender, no address, no explanation. But Emma knew. She read it again, slower this time. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from something far more rare in her life lately. A fragile, foreign flicker of hope. She sat down on the floor, back against the doorframe, and held the note like it might vanish if she moved too fast. Her first instinct was suspicion. Was this some kind of prank? A cruel joke from someone who had overheard her story at the diner? She'd seen how people pretended to care, right before they pulled the rug out. But deep down, that voice in her gut, the one she hadn't listened to in years, was already certain. JD. He hadn't come back since the night she forgot her sketchbook. She assumed that was it. Another curious stranger passing through, another half-kind moment that would blur into the static of survival. But now this. She stared across her small living room. The sketchbook sat on the table, exactly where she left it, still wrapped in the tissue he had returned it in. She hadn't touched it since. Emma stood up slowly, walked over, and picked it up. She flipped through it one more time. Her drawings of her mother, the back alley kitchen, the boy with the syringe. They still startled her. Not because they were dark, but because they were true. She ran her fingers over the spine. Was she really going to do this? Tomorrow, 10 a.m. She whispered the words out loud like she was testing them on her tongue. No job shift, no uniform, no tray to carry, just herself. The thought made her chest tighten, not in panic, but in something closer to fear's twin, vulnerability. She had spent so long being useful, being invisible. This would be the opposite, and yet her hands didn't put the sketchbook down. She made tea, sat by the window, watched the sun rise over the rust-colored Cleveland rooftops, and imagined what kind of place this note could be leading her to. No name, no promise, just a window, a chance to breathe. For the first time in months, Emma Grace set her alarm not for survival, but for something else entirely. She didn't know where she was going, but she was going to show up. And this time, she'd walk in with nothing to sell, nothing to explain, only the story in her hands and the woman she'd fought to remain. Because when someone leaves you a note like that, you don't ignore it. You follow the thread and hope to God it leads to a door that doesn't close. It was 1:03 a.m. when the sound hit her. Not a scream, not a fall, but something far worse. A thud muffled by linoleum and the cruel silence that followed. Emma bolted from the couch, her sketchbook still open beside her tea-stained mug. She found her mother curled in a half collapse beside the hallway wall, her arm trembling, her eyes unfocused and rolling upward. "Mama!" Emma dropped to the floor, cradling her as her mother's body shook violently. Her breath cut into short, stabbing gasps. Her fingers fumbled the phone. 911. Operator. Stay calm. But nothing in Emma was calm, only sheer reflex, the kind that's been honed by too many nights with too few answers. By the time the ambulance lights painted the street outside, her hands were red with the small scrape on her mother's chin, and her voice was ragged from calling her name over and over again. Inside the ER, it became a blur of IVS, oxygen masks, clipboards, and white coats asking things like, "How long did it last?" And "When was her last seizure?" Emma answered automatically. 3 minutes, maybe 4. She's stage 3 lymphoma. She's not eating. She fell 2 nights ago but didn't tell me. A nurse pressed a reassuring hand to her shoulder. "You did the right thing bringing her in. She'll be monitored here." Hours passed. The monitors beeped with a chilling steadiness. Emma sat at her mother's side, fingers curled into the blanket. Her sketchbook still sat in her purse across the room. Forgotten, irrelevant, distant. At 4:12 a.m., her mother stirred. Her voice was barely audible. "What time is it?" Emma leaned in. "Don't worry, you're safe." Her mother's gaze fluttered open, glassy but holding the same fierce softness that had raised a daughter on nothing but tenacity and borrowed time. "Your interview," she said hoarsely. "The note." Emma didn't reply. She couldn't. She stood, crossed the room, and retrieved the envelope. Opened it again. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Bring the sketchbook. It lay in her lap now like a cruel joke. How could she walk away from this? From the woman who had spoon-fed her faith, held her hair through night terrors, given up everything so she could chase colors and brushes across the page? But then again, how could she not go? That note, those 6 words, were the first knock on her door that hadn't demanded anything. It was her one door forward, her first chance since Boston to be seen again, not as a waitress, not as a caregiver, but as someone who made something. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered the question out loud. How do I choose between my only dream and the person who gave it to me? Her mother, half sleeping again, reached up weakly and brushed Emma's wrist. Not a command, not a goodbye, just contact, just love. The machines buzzed beside them, indifferent to destiny. Emma didn't sleep. She sat in the vinyl chair all night, watching the pale edge of dawn begin to crawl across the hospital blinds. Her mother's breathing steadied, and the weight of morning pressed closer. At 9:02 a.m., Emma stood, walked to the bathroom, splashed water on her face, tied her hair back. She looked in the mirror. What do you do when life demands 2 versions of you, and there's only time for one? She didn't have the answer yet, but she had 10 minutes, and her sketchbook was already in her bag. At 9:22 a.m., as the city stirred into motion under a rising sun, Emma sat by her mother's hospital bed and opened her phone. Her fingers hovered above the screen, the cursor blinking in an empty email field like a dare. The world outside the window buzzed with its usual distractions, a car alarm echoing in the distance, a nurse checking vitals across the hall. But in her small corner of the ER, time narrowed down to this moment, this choice. She reread the subject line 3 times. Regarding today's invitation. And then she wrote, no edits, no rehearsals, just truth. To whom it may concern, I am deeply honored by the opportunity to share my work. But I cannot be an artist if I abandon the one who gave me these hands. She shaped them with strength. She filled them with grace. Today, I choose to stay. Emma Grace. Her thumb trembled as it hovered over send. But she pressed it, breathing out with a finality that somehow didn't feel like giving up. It felt like becoming whole. Across town, in a high-ceiling boardroom filled with polished oak and espresso cups, still warm from catering, the Ohio Art Foundation's morning review was well underway. A few board members sat with their arms crossed, eyes darting between resumes and portfolios stacked in manila folders. One evaluator tapped her pen absently against a notepad. Another scrolled through a digital file. No one was prepared for the ping. The assistant opened the email first, then passed it forward. Silence rippled across the table as they read Emma's words. The chairwoman looked up, her expression unreadable. A younger board member, the same one who'd called her submission too raw just yesterday, exhaled slowly and said, maybe that's the most honest thing we've ever read. No one spoke for a moment. Then quietly, the director closed the folder labeled Grace, Emma. I'm not rejecting this, she said. We're suspending the review until she's ready. The room nodded, not out of pity, but out of respect. Something about the way she walked away from the spotlight, not for herself, but for someone else, shifted something in them. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance sat alone in his home office, a mug of half-drunk coffee cooling beside an unopened newspaper. He had been refreshing his inbox every few minutes, waiting to hear how it had gone. When the update finally came, a simple forwarded note from someone at the foundation, he read Emma's words once, then again, then lowered the screen. He didn't curse the timing, didn't curse fate. He simply whispered to himself, she chose right. Because J.D. Vance knew better than most that legacy isn't just what we build, it's who we refuse to leave behind when the building begins. And Emma, in that moment, had drawn something more profound than any canvas could hold. She had chosen love, and that, in itself, was art. The box arrived without a return address, just a plain package wrapped in brown paper, left outside Emma's apartment door like a whisper. When she peeled it open, her breath caught. Inside 10 pristine canvases, a fresh set of brushes, and a folded note written in unmistakably tidy script. No one's watching, just paint. There was no signature, but she didn't need one. That night, while her mother dozed off beneath a warm blanket with the TV buzzing faintly in the background, Emma propped up the first canvas against the bedroom wall. She sat cross-legged on the floor, brushes in one hand, palette balanced on her lap. The silence of the apartment stretched long, like a hallway with no doors. But in that silence, something stirred. She dipped her brush into a muted ochre and began. Not with a plan, not with precision, just instinct. The way she used to paint as a child, messy, curious, fearless. The first image emerged slowly, a figure curled up beside a hospital bed, half lit by a lamp, its face tired but vigilant. She didn't name it, didn't need to. By night 3, she painted again, faster this time, sharper lines, bolder colors. This one showed a mother's hand gripping her daughter's wrist, not out of restraint, but connection. The paint bled from fingertip to fingertip, binding them together in 1,000 unsaid things. Every morning, she wiped flecks of dried color from her cheeks. Every evening, she started again. The canvases stacked up against her wall like quiet testaments to nights survived. Her mother noticed. On day 7, while Emma was rinsing brushes in the sink, she asked softly, "Are these for someone?" Emma didn't answer directly. She simply replied, "They're for the parts of me I buried." That week, her work shifted. Less pain, more memory. A painting of two girls playing by a lake, a diner booth under dim lights, a pair of hands cradling a sketchbook as if it were glass. And then came the 10th canvas. She didn't touch it for 3 days. Each time she looked at it, her hands hesitated. It was too white, too full of expectation. But on the 30th night, she finally began. Not in the bedroom this time, but at the kitchen table, where her mother had once braided her hair while humming old country songs. She painted until 4 a.m. When it was finished, she stepped back. The image. A woman standing at a crossroads, shadows behind her, sunrise ahead. But what stood out wasn't the woman, it was her feet. Dirty, blistered, real. A journey rendered in brushstrokes. Not triumphant, not tragic. Just true. Emma didn't cry, but she closed her eyes for a long time, as if letting something go. The next morning, she found another note slid beneath her door. Tuesday, 2 p.m., Gallery 14. Bring them, all of them. She turned it over. No signature again, but the ink matched the first. Emma glanced at her mother, who was still asleep, then at the 10 canvases leaning against the wall. Some chaotic, some calm, all of them unapologetically hers. She whispered, "Maybe I wasn't disappearing. Maybe I was just waiting to be seen." And this time, she felt ready. By the 4th week, sleep became a luxury Emma could no longer afford. She painted not in bursts but in marathons. Brushes clutched so tightly her knuckles locked, shoulders hunched under the weight of everything she'd never said. Some nights she fainted where she sat, forehead pressed to the table, the palette still warm beneath her hand. But every time she woke up, even if just for minutes, she painted. The canvases began speaking before she did. Each one a confession wrapped in oil and pigment. Each stroke, a memory clawing its way out of silence. One painting showed her at 17, barefoot, windswept, standing in front of the Musée d'Orsay, her Paris scholarship badge around her neck. She wore a smile that hadn't touched her face in years, but behind her in the image, a shadow pulling at her coat. The caption she scribbled under the canvas read only, "Before it all fell." Another piece, haunting and quiet, portrayed a man at a kitchen table, his hands trembling as he tried to read through a stack of hospital bills. His wife stood behind him, blurred like a memory, refusing to fade. Emma had never met that man, and yet everyone who saw it swore they knew him, maybe because he lived in every rusted town, in every dim hallway lit by unpaid electric bulbs. But the painting that caused JD to freeze when he later saw it was the third one, a child no older than 5, sitting in the middle of a pitch-black room, holding a single glowing orb in her hands. The light didn't reach the walls, just her face, fragile, stunned, and still hopeful. Emma had titled it, "You either become the darkness or carry it." She painted until her fingers blistered, until her eyes stung too much to focus. But there was one canvas she kept returning to. The others were windows. This one was a mirror. The one who stays. A frail, older woman lay in a hospital bed, skin paper thin, and eyes closed in exhausted sleep. Beside her sat a daughter, not grieving, not despairing, but holding her mother's hand with unwavering stillness. No grandeur, no halo, just presence. Emma painted the woman's fingers 3 separate times, once too loose, once too tight. But on the 3rd try, she got it right. Fingers gently clasped, half holding on, half letting go. It wasn't just a painting, it was a reckoning. When she finished, she didn't title it in her usual rushed scrawl. She took a pen, wrote the name slowly on the canvas back, and whispered as if the act itself was sacred. "This is the one they won't forget." The painting bled, not in color, but in truth. By the end of 30 days, her apartment was no longer just a place she lived. It had transformed into a sanctuary of survival, heartbreak, and stubborn hope. The canvases lined the walls like sentinels, each one bearing witness to a version of herself that refused to vanish. She looked at the collection one last time before wrapping them carefully. Her hands were trembling, not from fatigue, but release. For the first time in years, Emma didn't feel like a waitress who had lost her voice. She felt like an artist who had found it, through grief, through exhaustion, and through a mother's quiet fight. She whispered into the morning stillness. They weren't just paintings. They were the parts of me I thought I'd buried. And when she looked down at her fingers, cracked, stained, and raw, she smiled. They were not broken. They were proof she stayed. The gallery opened its doors at exactly noon on a rainy Thursday in downtown Cleveland. No grand unveiling, no champagne reception, no press releases, just a single handwritten card on the door, taped beside the handle, slightly damp from the drizzle. Sketches of Survival. Emma Grace. Inside, the lighting was soft, warm, almost reverent. The white walls were bare except for 10 canvases, 10 fragments of a life held together by willpower, grief, and grace. No names were displayed next to the paintings, just quiet space for breath and interpretation. J.D. stood in the back near the exit, hands folded, coat still damp from the storm. He'd made only one call, to an old contact in Berlin who once said he could spot truth in brushstrokes before it had a name. J.D. didn't describe the artist. He didn't need to. He just said, "Come if you still believe some stories need no introduction." Emma arrived minutes later, walking hesitantly through the door, still unsure if this was real or a hallucination brought on by 30 nights without proper sleep. She wore no makeup, no new clothes, just jeans, a dark sweater, and her old sketchbook pressed tightly to her chest like armor. J.D. met her eyes once, offered no words, just a nod. She stepped inside and stopped. The paintings, her paintings, were no longer leaned against her apartment wall, half finished and seen only by shadows. They were now lit by gallery lights, framed in simplicity, given space to speak. A man entered quietly, tall with silver hair and a scarf that looked more European than Midwestern. He moved slowly, deliberately, like someone used to reverence. His eyes locked onto the third canvas, the child holding light in a dark room. He didn't ask about its meaning. He didn't look for the artist. Instead, he whispered to the curator, "I'll take this one." J.D., standing just close enough to hear, felt the air shift. The man didn't flinch at the price. $45,000. He signed the slip, bowed his head briefly to the wall, and left without another word. Emma hadn't moved. She was still in the corner, unnoticed, invisible in the best and worst ways. She stared at her own work with the gaze of someone trying to reconcile two versions of herself. The girl who once drew in Paris with wonder, and the woman who sketched next to IV drips at 2 a.m. to stay sane. A mother and daughter came in next. The child, no older than 10, stopped in front of the canvas of the hospital bed and asked, "Why is she holding her hand like that?" The mother looked down, smiled softly, and replied, "Because some love doesn't let go." Emma exhaled. For the first time that week, she let her sketchbook fall to her side. People trickled in slowly, as if called by something unspoken. No fanfare, just resonance. A middle-aged man wiped his eyes in front of, "You either become the darkness or carry it." A teacher asked if they could bring their class next week. A hospice nurse left a note. "Thank you for painting what we live with." J.D. remained in the back, watching Emma watch her work. He didn't say anything until the last light dimmed and the gallery cleared for the night. He approached quietly, looked at her, still clutching the worn edges of her sketchbook, and asked, "Do you see it now?" Emma didn't answer immediately. She looked around the room one last time, eyes lingering on each frame like an old friend. Then she whispered, "They heard me." And for the first time in years, she believed it. The gallery was full, but the room felt like it was holding its breath. On closing night, the final canvas was left uncovered. A new piece Emma had finished just days earlier. It was unlike the others, less detailed, almost abstract. A woman walking down a hospital corridor, her outline blurred. Trailing behind her was a ribbon of color, red, blue, gold, streaked with fingerprints. No plaque, no title, just space. A small podium stood near the front, though Emma had insisted she didn't want one. But as the lights dimmed and J.D. gave her a small nod from the back row, she stepped forward, not with confidence, but with clarity. She stood before the guests, dozens of them, collectors, teachers, nurses, veterans, a few teens who had come back a second time. Her sketchbook stayed closed at her side, as always. She looked at none of them directly and all of them at once. And then she began, I was never supposed to be here. Not because I wasn't good enough, but because life decided I had other roles to play. No one moved. I didn't paint for you. I didn't paint for gallery walls or auction tables. I painted because I was scared that if I didn't, everything I saw, the pain, the survival, the quiet grace of people like my mother, would disappear without a trace. Her voice was even, clear, not seeking sympathy, only truth. So, no, I won't be thanking you tonight. Not because I'm not grateful, but because praise isn't the point. Praise fades. Survival doesn't. She paused, then added, I paint so someone else remembers they exist. The room went still. You could hear the breath catch in someone's throat near the front. An older woman clasped her hands tighter. A young boy leaned closer to his father. Emma didn't bow. She didn't step back with flourish. She simply looked at the painting behind her, then turned and walked off to the side. A long silence followed, then a whisper from one of the curators seated near JD. We didn't discover her. She returned. JD closed his eyes and smiled faintly. There was no applause. No need. The message had landed deeper than any standing ovation ever could. People stood up slowly, moved toward the canvases once more. But gentler this time, like they weren't just viewing art, but visiting someone's memory. One woman left a sunflower beneath the final painting. Another wrote on a slip of paper, I remember now. Emma didn't return to the podium. She stood near the back exit with her hands in her pockets, watching her story leave her frame by frame, now carried by others. And when JD passed by, he didn't speak. He just nodded, as if to say, you didn't need saving. You just needed space. And in that quiet final moment, Emma Grace stood not as someone who had been rescued, but as someone who had, finally, come home. A month after the gallery closed, Emma didn't vanish into fame or chase exhibitions overseas. Instead, she moved in silence, just as she had lived, just as she had painted. With the first funds from the Berlin collector's purchase, she launched a nonprofit so quiet it had no press release, no gala, not even a name on the door. Just a handwritten note taped to a hospital room window in Akron. Art Hour, Room 6B. Come as you are. Her program started with just 5 children in the pediatric oncology ward. No formal easels, just lapboards and paper. She brought brushes, charcoal, watercolors, and silence. An intentional kind of silence. The kind that made space. The goal wasn't to teach, it was to witness. Emma told the kids gently, you don't have to draw something pretty, just draw something true. One girl aged 6 painted her 4th stand as a tree. Another drew a huge eye, watching from the corner of a blue room. But it was Daniel's sketch that made Emma stop mid-step. He was 8, frail, asthmatic. His picture had nothing but green dots scattered across the page. When Emma asked softly, can you tell me what they are? He replied with a shrug and a smile. Those are the moments I'm still breathing. She turned her face slightly, just enough for him not to see her tears. Emma didn't lecture. She didn't analyze. She pinned each drawing to the hallway board herself, carefully taping the edges like museum pieces. Parents would walk by with trays of food and just stop, speechless. One evening, a local arts columnist came through on a volunteer rotation and happened to glance at the wall. The next day, the paper ran a small column, barely 300 words tucked beneath an ad for air conditioners. This isn't therapy. This is testimony. In room 6B, children are not patients. They are prophets with paint. Emma didn't frame that article. She folded it and kept it in her sketchbook, just like all the things that mattered. Word spread, not fast but deep. More hospitals reached out. A social worker in Pittsburgh requested a pilot program. A nurse in Dayton asked if Emma would train volunteers. JD quietly connected her to a few donors, but never interfered. She had found her voice, and now she was helping others find theirs. She still painted, but now so did others. Not for prizes, not for praise, but because survival had a color. And they were the only ones brave enough to draw it. And in every brushstroke from every trembling hand, Emma Grace saw the thing she had once nearly lost. Not just art, but belonging. The sun had begun to stretch through the long hospital windows, casting faint golden beams across the walls of the art room. It was a quiet Wednesday. Emma sat beside a boy named Caleb, 7 years old, recovering from his third surgery, his hands still trembling slightly with every stroke of the brush. He didn't speak much, but that day he asked for black, yellow, and white. No blue skies, no rainbows, just contrast. For 30 silent minutes, he painted. When he finally pushed the paper toward her, Emma stared. It was a silhouette, a figure cloaked in shadow, featureless, standing before a cascade of golden light that burst outward behind him, like morning breaking through storm clouds. The lines were clumsy, the colors bold, but the message undeniable. Emma, caught between awe and confusion, asked gently, "Who is he?" Caleb looked up, his voice soft but certain. "My mom says that's the person who gave the light to Miss Emma." Emma couldn't speak. She didn't need to. The drawing stayed with her, not in a folder, not in a showcase, but right there, on the edge of her desk, propped beside her worn brushes and the original sketchbook that started it all. Below the painting, written in a child's careful print, was one sentence: "The one who stayed in the dark, so I could see." She never told JD about the picture. She didn't have to, because some people paint to be seen, and some people, like him, step back so others can be. And in that moment, Emma realized it wasn't just her art that had returned to the world. It was her worth, and someone somewhere had always believed in it, long before she did. This story is a quiet masterpiece about dignity, timing, and the kind of compassion that doesn't seek credit. What makes it powerful isn't just Emma's return to art, but the fact that someone noticed her before the world did. JD didn't save her. He simply saw her, and in doing so reminded us that not all heroes stand in the spotlight. Sometimes they wait in the shadows, offering just enough light for someone else to find their way forward. Emma's journey also challenges our view of success. It wasn't about fame, wealth, or applause. It was about using pain, honestly and unapologetically, to reconnect with purpose. That final drawing, the faceless figure, wasn't just a child's gratitude. It was a universal message. The truest acts of kindness often leave no signature. So now we turn to you. Have you ever had someone believe in you quietly when you couldn't see your own worth? And maybe more importantly, have you ever been that quiet light for someone else? Let us know in the comments. Your story might just be the spark someone else needs. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.